It all began in a quiet suburban neighborhood where most people minded their own business. The streets were lined with trees, kids rode their bikes in the evenings, and families gathered on weekends for barbecues or simple chats across fences. To anyone passing through, it seemed like a peaceful, welcoming place where everyone lived side by side without much conflict. But beneath the surface, not everyone felt the same way. In one corner of this neighborhood lived a woman who never truly felt at peace with her surroundings. On the outside, she seemed ordinary. She kept her lawn tidy, waved politely when others passed by, and showed up to community meetings when it suited her. But deep down, she carried with her a heavy weight, a resentment that had been building for years, shaped by her own beliefs and prejudices. She had a way of looking at people and deciding without ever speaking to them whether they belonged or not. For a long time, she had little to complain about. Most of her neighbors looked, spoke, and lived the way she thought was normal. She never questioned her comfort because her world looked the way she wanted it to. That sense of control, of familiarity, gave her comfort. But comfort doesn't always last forever. One day, a new family moved into the neighborhood. They were warm, friendly, and eager to start fresh in their new home. Their children laughed freely, their parents smiled when greeting neighbors, and they carried themselves with pride. From the moment they arrived, they did what every new family does. They painted their walls, decorated their porch, and tried to fit in. But for the woman across the street, their arrival felt like an invasion. She didn't see new neighbors. Moving in, she saw something she didn't like, something she thought didn't belong. And in her mind, their very presence disturbed the order she believed she had the right to protect. At first, her reaction was subtle. She would stare from behind her curtains whenever the family gathered outside. She'd shake her head disapprovingly when she saw their relatives visit. She started whispering complaints to other neighbors about noise, about parking, about things that never really happened. She painted them as disruptive even though they weren't. Her bitterness only grew stronger. The sound of their children playing in the yard annoyed her. The laughter she heard from their barbecues in the summer evenings made her clench her fists. And when the family began to connect with other neighbors, exchanging smiles and small conversations, she felt as though she was being pushed out of her own community. In her private thoughts, she convinced herself that she was the victim. She told herself the neighborhood had been better before. She believed the peace had been taken away from her. And the more she fed those thoughts, the darker they became. Soon her behavior shifted. She stopped being polite in public. If the family waved at her, she turned away. If their children accidentally kicked a ball onto her lawn, she scolded them harshly. If she overheard their music, she complained about it being too loud, even though it was no louder than anyone else's. Behind closed doors, her anger grew. She spoke about the family in harsh tones, even when no one was listening. She told herself that their presence was ruining everything. She wanted them gone, and the more she obsessed over it, the more dangerous her thoughts became. Yet to the rest of the neighborhood, it wasn't immediately obvious. People saw glimpses of her irritation, but brushed it off as her usual moodiness. No one could see the storm building in her heart. And certainly the family across the street had no idea how much resentment was being directed toward them. They went about their lives with smiles, not realizing that every step they took outside their home was being watched through suspicious eyes. The woman's anger was not only about the family themselves, but about what she thought their presence symbolized. In her mind, she tied their existence to every grievance, every change she didn't like. If her mail arrived late, she somehow blamed them. If the neighborhood became noisy because of construction or traffic, she told herself it started after they moved in. She twisted reality to fit the story she wanted to believe. This cycle of bitterness began to consume her daily life. She thought about them when she woke up in the morning and again before she went to bed. Every time she saw them smiling, it made her heart burn with jealousy. Their happiness was a mirror reflecting her own emptiness, and instead of fixing her own life, she projected all her frustrations onto them. Her friends noticed her growing negativity. Some distanced themselves, tired of her constant complaints. Others humored her but didn't take her seriously. This isolation only made her more determined to prove to herself that she was right. Then came the turning point. At a local gathering, when neighbors were chatting about how wonderful it was to have a new family in the community, she couldn't stay quiet. She interrupted, saying they didn't fit in and hinting that the neighborhood would never be the same again. Most people looked at her with discomfort, while others ignored her comment altogether. But for her, the rejection stung deeply. In her mind, she had spoken the truth, and yet no one supported her. That night, as she sat alone in her dimly lit house, staring out the window at the lights across the street, her bitterness deepened into obsession. The family wasn't just neighbors anymore. They had become, in her mind, the source of all her problems. And with every passing day, her thoughts grew darker. The neighborhood itself remained unaware of the storm brewing inside her. Children still laughed, people still walked their dogs, and life went on. But for one woman, the presence of a happy, thriving family across the street was unbearable. What had started as disapproval had now turned into something much more dangerous. She convinced herself that something had to be done. She wasn't sure when the line had crossed, but in her heart, she no longer saw them as neighbors. She saw them as enemies. And as dangerous as it sounds, she began to believe that removing them was the only way to bring back her sense of peace. What she didn't realize, however, was that the fire burning in her heart was not just directed outward, it was consuming her from the inside. As the days went by, the woman's anger refused to calm down. What had started as quiet disapproval had now turned into a storm inside her mind. She could no longer ignore the family across the street. Their presence felt like a constant reminder that the neighborhood she once believed belonged to her had changed forever. And every time she looked out her window, she felt more and more powerless. She tried at first to distract herself. She cleaned her house, worked in her garden, even tried to spend time with the few friends she still had. But no matter what she did, her thoughts always circled back to that family. It was as if they had taken over her mind, living rent-free in her head. She told herself it was because they didn't belong, but deep down, it was something else entirely. Their joy, their ability to carry on with life so freely, highlighted the emptiness in her own. Instead of facing her loneliness, she chose to blame them. At night, she would sit in her living room, the lights dim, staring across the street. She could see their home glowing warmly, laughter spilling from inside, children running across the porch before bedtime. It should have been an ordinary sight, one that most people would find heartwarming, but for her, it was unbearable. The more she watched, the more her anger twisted into something darker. Her mind began whispering ideas to her, thoughts she had never considered before. What if, she asked herself, the family simply left? What if they couldn't live there anymore? That would solve everything. She would finally have peace again. These thoughts grew stronger with each passing day, feeding on her resentment. She started to imagine scenarios where they might move away. Perhaps if she kept complaining to the landlord or the housing association, they would get tired and leave. Perhaps if she caused enough trouble, they would no longer want to stay. But those ideas didn't satisfy her. They took too long. She wanted something quick, something final, and so she began to plan. It started small, like a seed planted in her mind. She would whisper to herself late at night, convincing herself that she was the victim. She told herself the neighborhood had been better before they arrived, and now she was forced to live in misery. Slowly, that seed grew into an idea, a reckless and dangerous one. She thought about doing something that would not only remove the family but make sure they could never return. The thought of fire came to her one night as she sat by a candle. She watched the small flame dance, flickering softly in the dark, and she felt a strange pull toward it. Fire, she thought, was cleansing. Fire destroyed, but it also cleared the way for new beginnings. That was how she saw it in her mind. To her twisted way of thinking, fire wasn't just destruction, it was a solution. Once the idea entered her head, it refused to leave. She began to picture it in detail. She imagined the house across the street engulfed in flames, the family forced to leave, their happy voices silenced. She imagined herself standing in her yard, finally free from the noise and laughter she despised. To her, it felt like taking control back. She told herself it was only fair. In her mind, she wasn't the villain. She believed she was protecting her neighborhood, protecting the way things used to be. And when someone convinces themselves they are in the right, no matter how wrong their actions are, that belief can be dangerous. In the following days, she began to prepare in secret. She didn't tell anyone what she was thinking. Outwardly, she still went about her life as if nothing was different. But inside, her mind was consumed with planning. She thought about when the family usually went to bed, which lights turned off first, what time the streets were quiet. She studied their movements like a hunter watches its prey, memorizing details that most people wouldn't even notice. She even began collecting supplies. She did it quietly, making sure no one would suspect anything. A gas can here, some matches tucked away there. She hid these things where no one would see them, her hands trembling every time she picked them up. But she told herself it was necessary. With each step, she felt closer to carrying out what she believed was her mission. Yet even as she planned, there was a part of her that felt uneasy. Late at night, when the neighborhood was silent, she sometimes questioned herself. She would whisper, "What if this goes wrong? What if I get caught? If I get—" But the louder voice in her head always responded, "No one will know. It will be quick. And then life will be peaceful again." The more she listened to that voice, the stronger it became. Soon, the doubt faded, replaced with determination. She convinced herself she had no choice. One evening, as she stood in her kitchen staring at the family's house across the street, she clenched her fists. She thought about the years she had spent feeling overlooked, the times she felt disrespected, the life that had never turned out the way she wanted. She piled all of that anger onto the family, convincing herself they were the cause of her unhappiness. By now, she believed it fully. The decision was made in her heart. She wasn't just thinking anymore. She was preparing to act. She waited for the right night. It had to be quiet, late enough that no one would see her. She chose a day when the streets were empty, when no one seemed to be watching. She rehearsed it in her head over and over, almost as if she were writing a script for herself. She told herself that once it was done, she would finally have relief. No more laughter drifting into her window. No more children's footsteps on the sidewalk. No more reminders that the world around her was changing. In her mind, everything would return to the way it used to be. But what she didn't realize was that life never goes according to such dark plans. The same fire she believed would solve her problems was a fire she could not control. And though she imagined herself as the one in power, the truth was that her choices were about to set her on a path she could never undo. That night, as she placed the gas can by her back door and slipped matches into her pocket, her heart raced. She felt fear, yes, but also excitement. She thought she was about to reclaim her life. She didn't know, not for a single second, that she was about to light the very spark that would consume her own world. The night she had been waiting for finally arrived. The neighborhood was quiet, the streets empty, and the air heavy with stillness. It was the kind of silence that made even the smallest sound feel louder than usual. From her window, she saw the house across the street with only a few lights glowing. One by one, they began to turn off until finally the home was dark. The family was asleep. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stood in her own dimly lit kitchen. The gas can sat by the door, the matches tucked carefully in her pocket. She stared at them for a long moment, her hands trembling. For weeks, she had been preparing for this. She had replayed it in her mind again and again, telling herself this was the only way to bring back her peace. She whispered to herself, trying to calm her nerves. "This is it, just do it quickly." Stepping out into the night, she felt the cool air brush against her skin. The streetlights cast faint glows along the pavement, but most of the neighborhood slept in silence. Each step she took toward the house across the street felt heavier, her breath shallow and unsteady. She kept glancing around, afraid someone might be watching, but all the windows remained dark. When she reached the edge of their yard, her hands tightened around the gas can. She poured it slowly along the side of the house, her movements shaky, but determined. The smell was strong, sharp, filling the air with a sense of danger that she ignored. In her mind, she was focused only on the outcome. The family leaving, the laughter silenced, the street returning to the way she believed it should be. With the liquid spread, she reached into her pocket for the matches. Her fingers shook as she struck the first one, the tiny flame dancing before her eyes. For a second, she hesitated. The reality of what she was about to do pressed down on her. If she let go now, if she put the match out, everything could still return to normal. She could go back inside, pretend this night never happened. But then, she remembered the laughter that had annoyed her, the joy she envied, the change she couldn't accept. Her anger pushed her forward. With one swift motion, she tossed the flame onto the ground. The fire caught instantly. At first it was small, crawling along the liquid trail like a snake of light. But within moments it began to spread, flickering and growing as it touched the side of the house. She stepped back, her eyes wide as the flames rose higher, licking at the wooden panels glowing brighter with every second. For a brief moment she felt a strange rush of power. She believed she had done it, that she had taken control. She imagined the family waking to chaos, forced to run, their home no longer theirs. She pictured herself standing across the street watching them leave for good, but her satisfaction didn't last long. What she hadn't considered was how quickly fire spreads, how unpredictable it can be. The flames didn't stop where she thought they would. They grew, racing along the walls, climbing higher and higher until the entire side of the house was glowing orange. Sparks flew upward into the night sky, carried by the wind. That wind, gentle at first, shifted suddenly, blowing across the street. She stood frozen as she watched embers float through the air like glowing insects. They landed on her own yard, her own porch, the dry wood catching faster than she could have imagined. Her eyes widened in horror. She whispered to herself, No, this wasn't supposed to happen. The fire, alive and uncontrollable, spread toward her home. The very plan she had created to drive others away was turning against her. The flames she thought she controlled were now spreading in every direction, feeding hungrily on anything they touched. She ran back toward her house, panicking, trying to think of what to do. But fire is faster than fear. By the time she reached her porch, the edges of her home were already glowing, the heat pressing against her skin. She grabbed a garden hose, fumbling to turn it on, but the weak stream of water did little against the rising blaze. Meanwhile, across the street, the family woke to the smell of smoke and the blaring of alarms. They scrambled out of bed, confusion, turning to fear as they realized what was happening. In a rush, they gathered their children, calling out to each other, their voices echoing in the chaos. Within minutes, they were outside, coughing but safe, their eyes wide as they stared at the flames consuming their home. Neighbors began to pour out of their houses, startled by the noise, the glow lighting up the night sky. Some ran to help, shouting for everyone to get back while others called emergency services. The peaceful neighborhood that had once been silent was now filled with panic, cries, and the sharp crackling of fire devouring wood. The woman stood in the middle of it, all her face pale, her body shaking. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs felt heavy. She watched as both homes burned, realizing with horror that she had set this all in motion. The plan she thought was clever, the action she believed would solve her problems, had spiraled, out of her control within minutes. Firefighters arrived quickly, their trucks filling the street, hoses spraying powerful streams of water. Neighbors pulled the family to safety, wrapping blankets around them, comforting the children who were crying in fear. But when people looked at the woman, their eyes were filled with suspicion. She stood too close, too shaken, her guilt written all over her face. The night stretched on, filled with flashing lights, smoke billowing into the sky, and the heavy sound of water fighting flames. The once quiet street was now a scene of chaos. By the time the fire was under control, both houses were heavily damaged, one nearly gone. The woman's plan had failed. The family she had wanted gone was alive, standing strong together, comforted by neighbors who supported them. And she had lost everything. The fire she had started, meant to destroy others, had destroyed her own home first. As she stood there, shivering in the cold night, watching the ruins of what used to be her life, she realized too late that hatred had blinded her. What she thought was power had turned into her downfall, and there was no undoing what had been done. The night that was supposed to be quiet had now turned into complete chaos. Sirens filled the air, lights from fire trucks flashed across the street, and smoke rose high into the dark sky. Neighbors stood outside their homes, covering their mouths, watching in shock as two houses burned side by side. What had started as a single spark had grown into something unstoppable. The family who lived in the house she had targeted huddled together on the sidewalk. Their faces were pale with fear, their clothes covered in ash, but their arms were wrapped tightly around each other. They had escaped just in time. The sound of their children's cries mixed with the noise of the firefighters shouting orders as they battled the flames. Across the street, the woman stood frozen in her own yard. Her home, the place she had lived in for years, was now glowing with orange flames that crawled up its walls. The heat was so intense she could feel it from where she stood, her skin stinging as if the fire was reaching out to grab her. She wanted to run, but her legs felt heavy. It was as though the weight of her own choices had chained her to the ground. She had thought she was in control when she lit the first match. She had believed she could decide how far the fire would go. But now, standing there helplessly, she realized she had never been in control at all. The fire had a mind of its own, and it was merciless. Firefighters rushed past her, shouting for her to move back. One of them guided her further away from the burning house, but she barely heard his words. Her eyes stayed locked on the flames eating away at her porch, her windows shattering one by one as the fire grew louder. Every piece of her home that burned felt like a piece of herself vanishing with it. On the other side of the street, the family she had wanted gone was alive, clinging to each other for strength. They had lost their home, but not each other. Their togetherness, even in the middle of disaster, was something she could see clearly now. It was a sight that should have softened her heart, but instead, it filled her with a deep, hollow ache. She realized, too late, that what she had tried to destroy was something she could never have: unity, love, and peace. The neighbors began to talk among themselves, their whispers carried by the wind. Some looked at the fire with tears in their eyes, heartbroken at the destruction. Others looked toward the woman, suspicion already forming in their minds. They noticed the way she stood there shaking, avoiding eye contact. They noticed how pale she was, how uneasy. To them it seemed strange. One of the neighbors approached the family, wrapping a blanket around the children. Another handed the parents bottles of water. People offered words of comfort, saying, "You're safe, that's what matters, and homes can be rebuilt, but lives cannot." Their kindness was genuine, their support immediate. But when it came to the woman, no one offered a hand. She stood alone, separated not only by the fire but by the choices she had made. The firefighters worked tirelessly, their hoses spraying water in powerful streams against the burning homes. The hiss of steam filled the air as water met fire, but it was a long battle. Smoke thickened the night, stinging eyes and making it hard to breathe. The woman coughed violently, her throat raw, yet she didn't move away. She couldn't tear herself from the sight of her life crumbling into ash. She thought of all the years she had spent in that house, the memories she had built, the things she had owned. All of it was disappearing right before her eyes. She thought of her belongings, her furniture, her photos, her keepsakes. But deeper than that, she thought of the bitterness that had led her here. Every angry whisper, every hateful thought, every dark plan she had entertained, it had all brought her to this moment. And now she was standing in the middle of it, powerless. When the flames grew too fierce, firefighters pulled everyone further back. The street filled with flashing lights and shouts, but in the middle of the noise, the family held onto each other silently, their strength shining in their unity. The woman saw this, and it hit her harder than the fire ever could. She had wanted to break them apart, to strip them of their joy, but they were still together, stronger than she had ever been. As the hours dragged on, exhaustion fell over the crowd. The fire was finally being tamed, the furious orange glow turning into smoke and ash. What remained of the houses was little more than blackened frames, broken walls, and scattered debris. The firefighters moved carefully among the ruins, checking for any signs of danger, their faces somber. The family stood close to their neighbors, who promised to help them, who offered places to stay and shoulders to lean on. In the face of loss, they were surrounded by compassion. And that compassion only highlighted the woman's loneliness. She had burned bridges long before the fire burned her home. For the first time in a long time, she felt the sharp sting of regret, not just for the house she had lost, but for everything she had chosen to hold inside her heart. She thought back to the moment she lit the match, how quickly she had convinced herself it was the answer. Now, staring at the smoking ruins, she knew it had been the worst decision of her life. But regret doesn't rebuild homes. Regret doesn't erase choices. It only lingers, heavy and unforgiving. She sat down on the curb, burying her face in her hands, her body trembling. Around her, neighbors continued to comfort the family, but no one approached her. She was isolated, left in silence, with only the weight of her actions to keep her company. The night ended with the fire trucks finally pulling away, leaving behind a street that would never be the same again. The smell of smoke lingered in the air, a reminder of what had happened. The family, though shaken, walked with their neighbors to a safe place to rest. Their home was gone, but their bond was unbroken. The woman, however, stayed behind, staring at the charred remains of her own house. The silence returned to the street, but it was no longer the silence of peace. It was the silence of loss. And as she sat there staring at what she had caused, she finally understood that the fire she had set was never truly about them. It had always been about her anger, her loneliness, her refusal to change. In trying to destroy others, she had only destroyed herself. When the smoke cleared and the last fire truck pulled away, the neighborhood felt different. The once peaceful street was now covered in ash and the smell of burned wood. Two houses that had once stood proudly were now reduced to blackened frames and rubble. Neighbors stood silently in small groups, whispering to one another, shaking their heads in disbelief. It was a night no one in that community would ever forget. The family who had lost their home was still surrounded by support. Neighbors brought them blankets, hot tea, and words of comfort. Some offered a spare room, others offered to help with clothes and food. Even though they had lost everything inside their house, they still had each other, and that gave them strength. Their children clung tightly to their parents, frightened but safe, and that alone was something to be thankful for. On the other side of the street, the woman who had started it all sat quietly on the curb, staring at what was left of her own house. The reality was sinking in now. She had wanted to take away someone else's happiness, but in the end, she had destroyed her own life instead. Her home, her belongings, her sense of safety, everything was gone. As dawn began to break, the firefighters left, the neighbors returned to their homes, and the street slowly emptied. But the woman remained, staring at the ruins of her house, with hollow eyes. She felt the weight of what had happened pressing down on her chest. The fire hadn't just burned down walls and furniture, it had exposed the truth about her heart. She thought about the family across the street, the one she had hated for no reason other than her own bitterness. She had wanted them to suffer, but they had survived. They were hurt, yes, but they were still together, still standing strong. And she, who had wanted to destroy them, was left with nothing but ashes. For the first time in years, she truly saw the emptiness inside her. The family she had despised had something she had never built for herself: love, unity, and a community that stood by them. Watching the neighbors rally around them made her realize how isolated she had become. Her bitterness had pushed people away long before the fire had destroyed her house. The days that followed were filled with questions. Investigators came to the scene, asking how the fire started. Neighbors whispered among themselves, some suspecting the truth, but too shocked to say it out loud. The woman tried to keep her head down, but guilt weighed heavily on her. She couldn't sleep at night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the flames rising higher, felt the heat against her skin, heard the cries of the family she had endangered. The family, meanwhile, was determined not to let this break them. They leaned on each other and on the kindness of others. Donations came in. People from the community offered help, and slowly they began to rebuild their lives. Even in the face of loss, they chose strength and hope. That contrast could not have been clearer. On one side, a family who had lost their home, but found love and support. On the other, a woman who had lost her home and found only loneliness and regret. The woman realized too late that hate had not just hurt others. It had destroyed her from within. Every angry thought she had held on to, every bitter word she had spoken, had built up until it consumed her completely. The fire was only the final result of years of resentment. She had lit the match, but the truth was, the fire had already been burning inside her heart long before that night. As weeks passed, the neighborhood began to heal. The ruins were cleared, the street became quieter again, and people slowly returned to their routines. But no one forgot what had happened. It became a story that was told over and over, a reminder of how quickly life can change, how destructive hate can be, and how important it is to build bridges instead of walls. The family's resilience became an inspiration. They showed strength not just in surviving the fire, but in choosing not to be consumed by anger or revenge. They focused on rebuilding, on protecting their children's sense of hope, on moving forward with dignity. Their smiles, even after everything, reminded everyone around them that love is stronger than hate. The woman, however, carried her own reminder. Every time she walked past the empty space where her house had once stood, she felt the weight of her choices. The silence inside her heart was louder now, filled with regret that could never be erased. She had wanted to hurt others, but she had only ended up hurting herself. This story became more than just about two houses burning down. It became a lesson for everyone who heard it. Hate, no matter how small it begins, can grow into something destructive if left unchecked. Bitterness doesn't just poison others, it poisons the one who carries it. And when someone lets anger rule their life, they risk losing everything that truly matters. The family rebuilt, slowly but surely. With the help of neighbors and community support, they found a new place to live, and their children once again had a safe space to laugh and play. Their strength was admired, their resilience respected. They had every reason to give up hope, but instead they chose to rise from the ashes. The woman, on the other hand, lived with the consequences of her actions. She became a shadow of herself, weighed down by the memory of what she had done. She could never escape the truth that the fire she thought would destroy others had only destroyed her own life. In the end, this was not just a story about a fire. It was a story about the power of choices, the danger of hate, and the resilience of love. It showed that while anger and bitterness can tear someone apart, kindness and unity can help people survive even the darkest of nights. The neighborhood never looked at the woman the same way again. They had once thought of her as just another neighbor. But after that night, she became a reminder of what happens when a heart is consumed by hate. She had wanted to make the family across the street leave, but instead, it was she who lost everything. And so, the irony of it all became clear. In trying to set fire to someone else's life, she had set fire to her own.